Hello and welcome back to Deep Sleep Creep's YouTube channel. Today we're going to be looking at 10 true winter horror stories. So sit back, relax, and let's go deep. I, 21 female, live in a small city college town where homelessness, which was largely due to drug abuse, is a big issue. Down the road from my house at the time, there is a neighborhood Walmart that I always went to. Whenever I would go to this Walmart, I was always looking over my shoulder because of how many homeless people tended to hang out at this particular store and have on occasion followed me into and out of the store. As a woman, in general, I am always on guard, but because of the circumstances surrounding this store, I tend to get very paranoid when I'm there. Anyways, in the middle of the day on a weekday, I decided to stop by said Walmart to grab something small. This happened around January, and the snow was falling, making it cold when I drove out. When I pull into this Walmart, I always try to park as close to the front as possible with my driver's side facing the store so people can see me better. This day, I couldn't find a close parking spot. I instead found the closest thing I could find, and as soon as I pulled into the spot, I had a sinking feeling in my gut. I looked to my left to see two men in a black SUV and the driver staring at me. I looked away for a second, and when I looked back, I saw the guy in the passenger seat staring at me as if the driver had told him to look over. There's no way to perfectly describe this, but the look felt almost like a nod of approval to his friend that made me feel very uneasy. Against my better judgment, I decided to turn off my car and head inside. I figured I was only getting something small, so I'd be in and out fairly quickly. I grabbed what I wanted, and when I headed to the self-checkout, there was an issue that caused me to have to move to a cashier to check me out, and the whole process ended up taking a lot longer than anticipated. While I was waiting on the cashier, I noticed the man that was in the passenger seat was pacing outside the front doors of the Walmart looking in. I immediately felt that my gut was correct from earlier, and that he was waiting for me to head back to my car. I turned my back to him to check out, and when I looked back I noticed that he walked inside the store. At this point I thought I was crazy, and that the guy is probably coming inside to get some stuff, and I'm just paranoid from past experiences at this store. Anyways, as I'm leaving, I remembered a TikTok I saw where someone said they had interviewed a man who attacked women, and the man gave a few different reasons as to why he wouldn't attack particular women, one of them being that some women were on FaceTime. As I'm leaving the store and headed towards my car, I decided to FaceTime my best friend who I knew would answer the phone. As soon as I'm walking up to my car, she answers, and I look up to see the driver on the passenger side of his vehicle, where I would get into my car, blocking my way with his back passenger door wide open. My heart immediately dropped, and I asked the man to move out of the way. He looked down at my phone and then closed the door and moved out of the way. I'm assuming he looked at my phone to see if I was actually on FaceTime with someone. I quickly got into my car and started to drive away. As I was leaving, I saw the man who was in the passenger seat, who had been pacing in front of the store, coming around the corner quickly with a grin on his face and nothing in his hands from the store. I know I can be a very paranoid person, especially when it comes to this kind of thing. However, the whole encounter felt odd, and it didn't add up in a way that I felt could be written off that easily. Please let me know any thoughts. Also, a good tip if you are a woman who experiences situations like this, videotaping them or pretending to be on a call could also be a good idea. Use your best judgment and stay safe. I, 21 male, and my friend, let's call him Alex, was a 22-year-old male at the time this creepy encounter occurred. It was winter time. Luckily it was December, and we usually don't get real snow in my state until the end of December or early January. There was supposed to be a big snowstorm the next day, so my friend and I wanted to hang out until we were both trapped in our parents' houses. We like to smoke weed by our local church at night, because the area is usually quiet and fairly far away from the local village where we lived. One night at around 1 a.m, I picked up my friend and we headed towards the church for our smoke. It was cold that night, but there was no wind or rain, thankfully. Still, there were some clouds as I could see with some emptiness in the sky, and so it was very dark. As you drove up to the church, it had a concrete lane following up to its doors, and on the right-hand side was a large concrete platform serving as a parking lot that we both pulled into that night. This time we parked close to the church and the graves to the right of the church. The area wasn't very well lit as the light bulbs attached to the poles were very old yellow bulbed ones, not like the ones you'd see on the highway. The span of light wouldn't reach very far, leaving most of the surroundings in the darkness. The graves that surrounded the church were very old compared to the other graves that went all along the right-hand side of the concrete parking lot. The ones we were at were close to the church, and these dated back maybe 80 to 120 years ago, maybe even more. But anyway, that's where we parked. As we got out to light our blunts, we chatted about anything and everything, and were looking off into the distance, as you would while talking, until suddenly out of nowhere we both heard a massive scraping noise coming up at the back wall beside the fields and the graves we were by. I guessed it was just a cow itching itself with the wall, but my friend took the noise differently, as if it was someone doing it intentionally for us. We threw our blunts and I drove out and we both talked about it. It got me thinking that this was more of a hard material being forced along it, almost like a thick branch being ran side to side along the wall of the church where the field was. We both went back again for the sake of our blunts and out of curiosity whether or not I was right or my friend was right. We both found our previously disposed blunts and lit them again and chatted again. But we both got the idea to scan the area by the old graves where we heard the noise. And as I was scanning through the graves slowly and carefully, probably 4 rows of graves back where the noise was, there was something that caught my attention slightly. I did think it was a grave, but I looked again anyway because I just felt I had to. And there in front of me, meeting me face to face in the distance, slowly emerged this horrible thing or entity. I don't know what it was, but it had a dreadful presence. His face was very eerie white skin colour. It seemed to be nearly human-like, but only black sleeves and a black outline on the outer side of its legs. Both the inner part of his legs were white, and the torso area was also as white as his face. It had very large pitch-black hollowed-out eyes. No hair was present, no ears, I think, and its mouth was puckered very straightly across its face, maybe spanning only 2 to 3 inches. It was surreal to see this thing, as I'd never seen something like this, especially with someone. It definitely wasn't a person, because if it was, he was either clinically insane or just one creepy person that got a rise out of scaring people. But I knew I wasn't imagining it because I had my friend with me, and by his expressions I could tell for sure it was there. When I caught eyes with this thing, it slowly revealed itself by posturing itself up. It was small, maybe 5 feet 4 inch. I felt like I were pushed back with pure fear and dread when we both connected face to face. I knew this thing or person had very bad intentions, as I could feel the tension in between us, and it wasn't pleasant. He just looked as if it were looking through me. No expression, not even a blink, as if I were prey in its eyes, and that's exactly how I felt. I knew I had to go. Still, I tried to communicate as if it were actually someone just to see what he'd say and look. I'm not saying I'm a hard ass or anything, but I've got a big frame and feel I wouldn't be easily spooked with confrontation. But what we were seeing would freak the toughest of men. I said to it, "Well, we're going to go. Have a good night." As I reached the handle of my car door and still not a budge, just the empty, gaping black eyes staring, I quickly hopped into my car as quick as I could and spun out of there. I still think of this thing quite often, but my friend chooses to forget about it. And I'm just curious as to what it may have intended and what it may have wanted. I mean, it wasn't there staring for nothing. Maybe he wanted us to leave his home, as if it were protective of the property. But why is such a thing around the house of the Lord? I know what we saw. We frequently smoke weed, as it is a bad habit we developed over time, and we weren't nearly high enough for our minds to play tricks on us. To put in context, it's like an alcoholic who commonly drinks 12 beers a night and only had one. I swear what we saw, we were damn near sober, especially since I knew I was driving. I wanted to be sure I wasn't high out of my mind, and we barely got through half a blunt. Maybe a quarter if I'm being honest. Please tell me your opinions on what you might think this could be and what it might have had in mind, because it still haunts me to this day. Thank you in advance. Just as a heads up, there are a few details that have been edited out for privacy reasons, but this story is still true, and what I experienced was completely true. I'm a researcher in New Mexico. My station is on military land, which stretches for miles and miles in all directions. This occurred around December. Being that we were in New Mexico, we don't typically get snow, it just sometimes gets a bit chiller than usual. There aren't really hiking trails inside the property, but that hasn't really stopped any of us from hiking in the area. The general population absolutely cannot be on the property, and there are large fences to prevent this. But for those of us that live or work out here, it's not a problem. There are weapons testing sites that would be absolutely off limits for anyone, including us. But this particular piece of land isn't part of that. Last year I was out on a hike, about 15 miles from the northern edge of the property, in a deep region of the forest out here, and I came across a manhole cover in the woods. I wouldn't have seen it, but there was a downed tree blocking the path I was making through the forest. It's all back country in that northern area. I ducked under the tree, and that's when I saw it underneath me. I stopped to rest next to it, listening for any sounds of other people, but I knew there wasn't anyone around me for miles. The federal property here is well away from any city. You'd have to walk 50 miles just to get to the northern border of our property. Curiosity got the best of me, and I used one of my hiking poles to remove the lid. It wasn't locked, which was surprising, but I just figured there was going to be a sewage pipe down there, and that was it. So maybe the feds didn't feel it needed to be locked. Instead, I descended a ladder for about 20 feet and found a series of tunnels. Not tunnels like you might think would be there, not a sewage area. I mean, tunnels as in large, clean tunnels that a truck could drive through. I had absolutely no idea what I'd stumbled into. Research in one area does not gain access to research in all areas, so my first thought was that I'd just come upon an underground research unit, possibly a large bomb shelter meant for military personnel. I had no idea. So I followed the tunnel in a northern direction for about half a mile. It was dark, but I had a headlamp. Finally, I came to a set of steel double doors. On top of the doors was a camera, but there wasn't a blinking light that might indicate it was operating, and with the darkness of the tunnel, I got the feeling that the area was no longer operational. I tried one of the doors, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. It creaked on its hinges but swung open without too much force. Have you ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark? The end scene shows this giant warehouse with all of these wooden crates, one of them being the Ark. What I saw was like that. A giant warehouse with so many crates I couldn't possibly guess at the number. 10,000? I don't even know. They weren't wooden though. They were all steel, and none of them were marked. Most of them were the size of a love seat or small table. Some were bigger, and it was pitch black. The only reason I could see anything was because of my headlight. Have you ever been in a pitch black abyss with only a headlamp? It's completely unnerving. I knew at that point that I'd really stumbled onto a place that, if I was caught, would not end well for me. I wasn't supposed to be there, and I didn't see another door out of the warehouse either. Eventually I went back to the tunnel, and then up through the manhole again. I then marked the location so that I could come back one day soon. I wanted to bring my friend with me to show him what I'd found. A month later, we were back at the area, but when I approached the area that I knew was correct, instead of the downed log, there was a 10-foot high fence around the manhole. It encompassed about 100 meters of area around the manhole. We left quickly. Obviously, either the camera on the door was working or there was another camera that I didn't see. But someone saw me. I think they probably thought I was just a random person. Maybe they never got a good look at my face on the camera. I don't know. But that warehouse and its secrets keep me up at night. And so does the feeling that I'd stumbled upon something that I wasn't supposed to know about. This all happened when I was a kid, Well, a young teenager, but still a kid. I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the oldest of three, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counsellor told them they should go on a weekly date, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stick together. This freaky event occurred when I was home alone, early December around 2007. I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Have fun," I called out as fog released from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. Wrapping my arms around my torso in response to the chilly mountain air, I entertained myself for a few brief moments by exhaling forcefully and watching my breath float away into nothing. And there was truly nothing around me, not a car or a creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, shutting the door behind me. David and Sophie were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help but feel like an only child. David, 3 years younger, was severely autistic and not talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words. Milk and sandwich was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Sophie, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2. The 9-year gap between them is glaring, but to this day my parents swear to me Sophie wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school, when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. David in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Sophie in her crib in front of Sesame Street. Myself, I ignited the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. God, that was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read, in perfect contentment, for nearly an hour. Night had fallen by then and the room had become toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard David's heavy footsteps descending the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" David just stared at me blankly. "David," I said more clearly this time, "did someone knock at the door?" "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." "Knocking on window?" I stood up, now wide awake. "David, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought. But being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy, in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees and there were no homes within a quarter mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably my friends, I thought. But what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told David. Hand trembling slightly, I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Sophie's room. Sophie. I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart thumped in my chest. "This is silly," I told myself. "Be a man." I made my way down the hall to David's room and stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. If this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars, Battlefront's game-paused screen. I listened for a moment but heard nothing. I began to suspect that David had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat exasperatedly, I moved to the window and flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night, relieved, as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes trailing to what appeared to be footprints just beneath the window's frame. At first I did not comprehend them. I just stared, transfixed, at the deep imprints in the snow. Shoes. A man's shoes. None of my friends wore that size shoe, which made me even more sick to my stomach. I traced them backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from whence this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree was still there. In a panic, I quickly backed away from the window. David, sensing my fear, began to whimper. No, shh, I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off and led David out of the room. I quickly pulled Sophie from her crib, powered her TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," David said, and Sophie began to cry. I shushed her hurriedly as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat David down on the couch and settled Sophie in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move. Do you understand? Do not move. I need to call the police." I would have called my parents, but this was 10 years ago, and they didn't have cell phones. So I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. Silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Again. Nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line, but there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there wasn't even a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Sophie's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was toward the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped, but now they continued. Sometime while I was herding my siblings downstairs, whoever was behind the tree had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man standing near the driveway. He was looking right at me. My breath stopped. I was frozen in place. This was not one of my friends. I had never seen this man before, but he was looking at me with an eerie blankness. He was wearing a black turtleneck and black slacks, a lone dark spot on a blanket of purest white. My eyes never left him and his never left me. We stood still, silently staring, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thumped in my chest and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility of my death. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident at age 11. At this, the tears flowed freely once more. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I couldn't help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked toward the sky, toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but obviously I couldn't hear it. I stared, transfixed, as he pulled a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, still muttering to himself, he flung the stuff at his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought that to let this man out of my sight would be stupid of me. I figured it was better to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I convinced myself. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring towards the sky, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. It was a knife, a long, callous blade, which he had removed from his other pocket. It bore dark stains already. From what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale stomach. For some reason I thought he was going to stab himself in the stomach, but he only cut himself. Still pretty bad, but better than what I was thinking. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils, but he looked happy, beyond happy, elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was on ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more, and his eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me and ran to David and Sophie. "No more screaming," David pleaded. No more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair in an effort to calm him down. Sophie, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained, listening intently. Is he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and had retreated, or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally I heard it, the subtle but unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside the house, and by the sound of it was trying to be quiet. I silently guided David and Sophie into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well, in the bathroom down the hall, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand or maybe the hutch. "He's here!" the man shrieked hysterically. "How dare you hide from him?" To this day, I don't know who he was talking about, but it was at that moment, the moment I heard him begin to descend the stairs, that I made my move. Holding Sophie in one arm and guiding David with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, stood on the toilet, and placed Sophie gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told David to get on. "Yucky gross, no standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get David to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "David, get on the effing toilet," I snarled at him, the first time I had ever said that word. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did step onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once he almost slipped back down. Almost. But he was stronger than I thought he was, and managed to pull himself back up. With both of my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of glass. "Why are you hiding from him?" "Cold!" screamed David as I led him barefoot through the snowy grass. In panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Sophie were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as possible. I heard a distant crash from inside the house and I quickened our pace. Feet numb, I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk and practically had to drag David onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving. And he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks and not even comprehending it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed toward. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Sophie's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I needed to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and saw a light off in the distance. The Andersons' house. I said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Anderson my entire life, but that was our only option. It was in their house that we would seek refuge. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I did not let up the pace until David tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly, looking back at his stumbling block. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see David had fallen into blood. A dead man lay, face up and eyes open on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he had been mostly invisible until David's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I had seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pleaded, wrenching my eyes away from the grisly scene as I pulled David to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds, maybe, and finally reached the Andersons' front door. The window into their parlour was open, and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson sat drinking tea in cosy armchairs. I pounded furiously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Sophie to Mrs. Anderson and collapsed into tears. I explained the situation between sobs, and they did not hesitate to call the police. I think I muttered something like intruder, knife and dead body. I was absolutely hysterical, but that's all I could get out. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later and apprehended the man, unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Sophie's room and intestines partially protruding from the wound on his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where we had climbed, hit his head and knocked himself out. Apparently he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, does not even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night, but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he killed, the man lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black, stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarmed around the block and their home a crime scene. My father relocated at work, and we had moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. It was a horrific night I can never forget. I still have some PTSD from it and have received counseling. It still freaks me out to this day. I still to this day do not know what happened to my friend. It still haunts me at night, and I don't know how to approach the situation. A couple of days ago, my friend came to my place. His eyes were wide with fear and excitement. He'd found something in the forest just next to his house. It was cold outside. Winter had just came, making the ground frozen when he came across a camcorder just lying there on the ground. He was hell-bent on seeing the footage that could be on it. I had this gnawing feeling it could be linked to a crime or something like that, but his persistence was too much, and it was not like we had anything better to do. We connected the camcorder to my TV. We didn't know what to expect. I was hoping it would be nothing. And at first it seemed to be just that, a regular video of some guy walking his dog in the forest. But then they approached this fallen log. The man hopped over it. Then he beckoned his dog to follow. The dog just sat there. It turned its head looking confused. That's when we saw it. The dog's body contorted in ways that defied nature, morphing into a humanoid shape, standing grotesquely on its hind legs. Its head snapped upwards, front limbs twisted like human arms. It then jumped over the log, just like a person would. The silence from the man holding the camcorder was deafening, broken only by his heavy, panicked breaths. I wish he had turned the camera away, but he didn't. He kept filming this thing. We both sat there, transfixed in terror, staring at the screen. I was so overwhelmed I couldn't muster up anything to say. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. My body was paralyzed. Then, we heard the most horrific screech. I don't know if it was the man or the dog. My friend was beside himself, oscillating between denial and pure terror. He tried to rationalize it, to convince himself and me that it was some sick prank or that all of this was a dream. We were both shaking, trying to process if any of it was real. We decided to take the camcorder to the police first thing in the morning. My friend was too scared to go back home, so he crashed at my place. But when morning came, my friend was gone. He just vanished. The camcorder is still here. I've called him countless times, texted him, but there's been no response. I'm freaking out. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified that whatever was on that tape is more than just a video. What if it's out there? And now with him missing, I'm scared to even step out of my house. I don't know if going to the police is the right move. What if they don't believe me? What if they think we tampered with evidence? But I can't just sit here doing nothing while my friend could be in danger. I need advice, any kind of help or insight you guys can offer. Have you ever heard of anything like this? What should I do? Please, I'm begging you. I just want to find my friend and make sure he's safe. I was catching up with a childhood friend the other day, and he brought up an encounter we had years ago that I haven't thought about in a while. We were 12 and playing manhunt with our friends late at night. We lived in a heavily wooded area in New England and had created a fairly extensive network of trails that went pretty deep into the woods over the years. Since it was pitch black in those woods, we would run around with flashlights, only turning them off to hide from the hunters. One cold winter night, my friend was chasing me down one of the trails with his flashlight on, and mine's off in hopes I could slip behind a tree to evade him. At an intersection of two trails, I made a sharp left down a trail we had just recently added to our network, and was almost immediately met by what I initially thought to be another hunter. I tried to make a sharp cut off the trail to evade the second hunter, but slipped and got tagged out by the initial hunter. As I was getting up, I looked to see who the other hunter was who cut off my escape and quickly realized that it was none of my friends. The creature looking back at us stood on 4 legs, towering over us at about 7 feet tall, with its front legs longer than its hind legs, which also seemed to be bent backwards. It was completely devoid of hair of any kind, and its skin was a pale green hue, almost like it was decaying off. Its eyes glowed yellow in the light of the flashlight, with a face that seemed almost human in an uncanny way. Both my friend and I stood frozen for what felt like an hour before sprinting out of the woods as fast as possible, not looking back even once to see if we were being pursued. After that encounter, neither of us dared enter those woods for a solid month. Now, my initial thoughts on this is that we saw a deer with some sort of horrible disease, although what we saw did not resemble any of the thousands of deer I'd ever counted prior to that experience, nor in the decade since. I have since dug deep into cryptid sightings in that area, and again was unable to find anything that resembled the description of the creature we encountered. Does anyone have any ideas, both natural or paranormal in nature, that could perhaps help describe what we both saw that night? This is a short story from when I was in high school around winter 2010-ish. My parents' house backs up to a small wooded area. It's not a forest by any means. There are walking trails and other neighborhoods around, but the woods are big enough that we used to see deer and the occasional fox. There was also a small creek that ran through it, and I used to spend time in the fall or winter poking around back there when it wasn't obscured by brush. I found what I assume was likely a deer path that ran all the way up to my old elementary school, which was about a block away via roads, but using the deer trails took about 10 to 15 minutes. I was back in this area fairly often, which is why the following story was so weird. I went down to the creek one day and followed the trail like normal, but this time I found a partial deer skeleton at the end. The head and front legs were missing, but the rest was still there and there was no flesh at all on the bones. They were stripped absolutely clean and the bones were still a bright white. At the time, there weren't coyotes in the area like there are now, and I'd seen a bobcat once when I was little, but they definitely weren't very common. To this day, I have no idea how that skeleton got there or what happened to it. It was too clean to be a predator kill, and that also doesn't explain why the front half was missing. I got so freaked out that I never went back into those woods again. I, 20-year-old female, spent my whole life living on a small isolated road about 15 minutes away from the city. My parents built the house my siblings and I have lived in our whole lives. I have 3 siblings, all of us being females. We have neighbours but also aren't too close together like an urban community. One of our next door neighbours, let's call him Frank, has lived on his property about as long as my parents have. Growing up, I always have gotten a weird gut feeling from this man, and my mum has always told me to listen to it. I have never been alone with him and never plan on it. He lives alone, had a girlfriend when I was around 10 years old, and had a dog who sadly passed away a few years back. My older sister and I would go over to his house and spy on him through a small hole in his barn when we were younger. Tons of pornography hung up all over his barn. Growing up, he has always shown up to our house whenever we have a bonfire or any event where he can hear people having fun. Always unwelcome, and it's obvious no one wants him there, but still he never leaves. His excuse for this behaviour is being drunk. Around January, I had a birthday party at my house for turning 17 that year. We typically didn't get a lot of snow where I lived. The weather was sunny but still a little chill hung in the air, probably from the creep, but I digress. It was absolutely perfect, and I was surrounded by all of my loved ones. While things were wrapping up and people started heading home, Frank continued to stay, quite usual for how he is, but nonetheless frustrating. We began to have fun, and it got to a point where the only adults there were my parents and Frank. My mum had went inside to go to bed, and my dad was beginning to get tired and kept hinting to Frank that he should be heading home soon. Frank said, "All right, man." He then proceeded to pull out a chair and sit and watch us all play cup pong while staring at miners' asses. My older sister went up to my dad and expressed how uncomfortable it had made her that he was staring at a bunch of miners' asses. My dad is not a confrontational man, but has always made sure we feel safe and comfortable, and will be confrontational when the time comes. My dad then told Frank he needed to leave immediately. Frank refused and said, "I'll stay here and watch over the kids while you go to bed." That right there sets us all off. One of my friends then starts yelling at Frank, telling him he needs to leave and it's not okay for him to be here, and after we have asked him multiple times to go, he eventually leaves. But ever since then, he's been making extremely gross and inappropriate comments to my dad about how attractive my younger 15-year-old sister is. My dad has confronted him multiple times about how inappropriate his behaviour was, and he still will not change this behaviour, and still will come over after being told to stay on his property. Whenever I leave my house to go anywhere, especially at night, Frank watches me through his window. It just freaks me out. He gives us all such a weird, creepy gut feeling, and nothing we do to confront him seems to work out. He's done a lot of weird things like this all throughout my childhood, but it's been at an all-time high recently. Any ideas on how to stop this? This happened when I was younger, maybe around 13 to 14 years old. I was walking to town with my mother. I live in a smallish town in England. It was a quick walk, 15 minutes. But about 5 minutes after leaving my house, I had one of the most unsettling encounters ever. Whilst walking, there was a man approaching us. Nothing weird at this point. I thought he'd walk past us like everyone else. However, this random man leaned in towards me as he was walking past and whispered something to me. I remember it being creepy and along the lines of him knowing where I lived. It was subtle and happened quickly. I was shocked, especially since my mother was right next to me. Bold move from a creepy guy. I recall the man being possibly in his late 20s, kind of scruffy looking, a little chubby, with longish brown hair and a beard. But I knew I'd never seen him before this point. I waited a few seconds for us to distance ourselves from the stranger, then turned to my mum completely freaked out and quietly asked if she heard what that guy had said. She said she didn't. I thought maybe I'd misinterpreted the situation or misheard him then. We kinda brushed it off and continued with our day. I felt uneasy but tried not to think about it. Rest of the day was fairly normal. Until the morning after when my dad was talking to our neighbour. A neighbour told my dad that during the early hours of the morning, there was a man lurking right outside our houses for some time, hovering around my dad's and neighbours' cars. Now this is really weird because we live in a kind of closed-off area. The only people we see outside our homes are our neighbours, but even they wouldn't come right up to our doors, especially not at like 2 to 3 a.m. Even delivery drivers can't find our house most of the time because we're hidden away. This has never happened before and never happened again after this, at least to our knowledge. Of course, you can imagine how absolutely terrified I was to hear this. I explained to my dad what had happened the day before and reminded my mom, kind of an "I told you so" moment. I felt so scared to be in my own home. I remember calling my friend and talking about the situation. We researched about what we could do, but there wasn't really any action we could take. Just had to be observant and cautious, I guess. I can't remember much about what happened after that, but I never saw the man again. The whole situation creeps me out and it doesn't make sense. The man outside my house wasn't confirmed to be the same man that walked past me earlier, as it was too dark to make out any discernible features. But it sure is an amazing coincidence if so. Never knew where to talk about this experience, but I figured it belongs here. I'd love to hear your opinions and theories. I work on shift, so one week I'll be doing early shift 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. and the other is a late shift 2 p.m. to 11 p.m. The area I live in is known for being pretty rough, and it's common to have sex workers lurking around, and I have sadly been propositioned many times. Also see loads of meth heads too, especially at night. But one time was strange. I finished work at 11 p.m. and took the 15-minute drive home. When I arrived, I parked my car on the street as normal, having to parallel park between two cars. Once I was parked up and just before I switched the car off, I noticed a lady run across the road to the entrance of the building where my apartment is. She then just stood there staring directly at me in my car, without moving or looking away. She was like this for about 2 minutes. Since I still had my car on, I decided to leave the parking space and proceed to park on the opposite side of the building where there's a second entrance. As I drove past her standing at the entrance, she was watching me and didn't even take her eyes off me until I was out of sight. I got in the other entrance safely and not sure where she went after this. My thoughts are this: how did she know I was heading for that entrance? Why did she wait for me there? Was she trying to get the code to unlock the door so she can get in the future? Did she have an accomplice hiding around the corner? Did she just want some business? This hasn't happened since, but I think about it regularly and wonder what would have happened if I'd got out of the car and used that entrance as normal.